Evolution Part 1. So you might be different positions tonight. You might think, well, you don't necessarily agree with evolution, or you partly agree with it, or you might think it's absolutely fantastic and it's foolproof, and it's sort of like 2 + 2 is 4, or the law of gravity, or something like that. Well, I want to give you, first of all, a quotation from Julian Huxley, who was descended from Charles Darwin, from Thomas Huxley, who was Charles Darwin's bulldog. He was a main spokesman for Charles Darwin at the time. He said, Darwin's theory is no longer a theory, but a fact. And it might be that some of you are absolutely convinced of that. And that's one position. However, some scientists take a completely different view, in particular in the last 10 years. Here's a quotation by Professor James Shapiro, who's a leading bacteriologist, University of Chicago. He says, for those scientists who take it seriously, Darwinian evolution has functioned more as a philosophical belief than as a testable scientific hypothesis. This quasi-religious function of the theory is, I think, what lies behind many of the extreme statements that you have doubtless encountered from some scientists opposing any criticism of neo-Darwinism in the classroom. It is also why many scientists make public statements about the theory that they would not defend privately to other scientists like me. Now, that is quite a challenging quotation. And I don't know how you regard that, whether your blood's boiling or what's going on when you see a quotation from a leading scientist. As far as I know, he has no particular religious axe to grind whatsoever, but this is his observation as a scientist. Before we get into the talk, I really want to look at what is evolution, to make sure that we're actually batting on the same wicket, as it were. And so I've taken an Oxford English Dictionary definition. The origination of living things by development from earlier forms, not by special creation. In other words, there's been a long process from amoeba through to philosophers to us today, but not any divine supernatural intervention that brought it together in the first place. Now, I regard natural selection and adaptation as being very clear scientific principles because they can be observed, they can be repeated, and they can be examined thoroughly. But I'm here to demonstrate that evolution has its roots in an ancient philosophy going back thousands of years, and to trace that philosophy to its modern-day form. Now, you might think that it all began with Charles Darwin. I remember studying biology at school, and I thought, that was it. Charles Darwin was this amazing scientist. He went off to the Galapagos Islands and studied wildlife out there, and he wrote his book, Origin of Species, and published it in 1859, had a world impact. And I thought it all originated with him. And probably most people actually go through the education system would think the same. I've certainly asked a number of students here, and they are under the impression that Charles Darwin really came up with it. But that is simply not true. Often, in major paradigm shifts, as they're called, change of thinking, there have been many people before. So let's look at a quotation from Charles Darwin himself. He said, until recently, the great majority of naturalists believed that species were immutable productions and had been separately created. This view has been ably maintained by many authors. Some few naturalists, on the other hand, have believed that species undergo modification and that the existing forms of life are the descendants by true generation of pre-existing forms. Passing over the allusions to the subject in classical writers, the first author who in modern times has treated it in a scientific spirit was Buffon. He was a chap from the Enlightenment period, the 18th century. He was influential, along with people like Voltaire and others, for David Hume, who became the father of the Enlightenment movement here in Edinburgh. But this is the Origin of Species, 6th edition, 1888. The passing over the allusions to the subject in classical writers is what's going to be my thing I'm going to retarget on tonight. And he does actually, in this footnote, mention Aristotle. And he says, we see here the principle of natural selection shadowed forth, and the classical Greek philosophers. Now, India had their own sort of Enlightenment period, which went on for centuries. And here's a classic case of one chap, I guess, who was an agnostic. And he's saying, whence is this creation? The gods came afterwards with the creation of the universe. Who then knows whence it has arisen? whence this creation has arisen. Perhaps it formed itself, or perhaps it did not. The one who looks down on it in the highest heaven, only he knows, or perhaps he does not know. So you might be a person just like that tonight, who's agnostic. You're not quite sure whether there's an intelligent designer behind it or whether it all evolved by itself. Well, you're in the same boat as this guy 3,200 years ago. Now, we're going to look, and this might be quite strange for you to even consider, looking to Indian Brahmins into Hinduism going back thousands of years ago. And I'm looking at this section now, I've called the rise of the pantheistic evolutionists, who in my understanding and research, were the forerunners of evolutionary thinking. Now, pantheism, just in case you're not sure what that means, is basically the Hindu or pagan concept that God is everything. Nature is God. So we will now look at a quotation, just so you see. And it was an interesting thing. When I began to research, I came across others who had actually gone before me and done research. And it's really nice when you actually find others confirming stuff that you've been digging around yourself in the long hours in libraries. But here's a quotation from a man, Sir Moni Williams, who is a professor of Sanskrit, University of Oxford, generally regarded as one of the leading experts in the study of Hindu philosophy and Sanskrit, both in the 19th through to the early 20th century. He says, indeed, the Hindus were Spinozists 2,000 years before the birth of Spinoza, Darwinians centuries before the birth of Darwin, and evolutionists many centuries before the doctrine of evolution had been accepted by the Huxleys of our time, and before any word like evolution existed in any language of the world. Now that's quite a statement. And within these scriptures of the Hindus, it's a combination of both religious thought and philosophical thought that come together. Bear that in mind as we go through. One of the first things you have to point out, if we're looking first of all at the cosmology before we even get into the biological understanding, is that the Hindus had an idea of an eternal universe, a cyclical universe. In other words, it's depicted there, as you see, as a serpent with a tail in its mouth, kind of like a circle going round and round and round. The universe has an apparent beginning, has an end, starts again after a gap, has an end, has a beginning, has an end, and continues. Interesting enough, people like Sir Fred Hoyle, who was a very well-known astrophysicist, was very keen on the idea of an eternal universe. People sometimes called it an oscillating universe, or other names were given to it. No doubt, and I've seen some articles in Scientific American and also in New Scientist, that there are people even discussing the possibility of an eternal universe all over again. The popular view at the moment is singularity. Big Bang begins and it has just one start. But watch that space. So that's what the Hindus and most of the pagans believed in. Now then, let's look at another thing. Now, in Hindu understanding, you had what's called a Trimurti, which is the gods of Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. Now, for the religious people, they were seen as gods. Within that, you're supposed to have the sort of equilateral triangle of these three gods, but you also get this thing. It says here, these, that is the creative processes that the universe goes through, in succession acquire the attributes of the immediately preceding ones from which they have originated. Each has not only its own special attribute, but each succeeding one has the attributes of all the previous ones, and that's from the Mahabharata. So that principle is contained right from the beginning, at the start of our particular present universe, and is contained within the whole process, including life. That what was before is built on. So in other words, there were more simple forms and more complex forms were built up out of it through a process. Even though this is such ancient philosophical understanding. Let's move on now to Hindu biological evolution and reincarnation. Now, if you look on the right-hand picture, is a picture of reincarnation. In one sense, reincarnation's got nothing whatsoever to do with evolution. Because what you have is a person dies and the soul leaves the person and ends up in another life form. It could go up and become a another lighter-skinned human being, or it could go down in animal form, depending on karma, whether the person's done good deeds or bad deeds, and so on. That's very much written into Hindu religious understanding. But before you just cast aside reincarnation, there's another point which also is grafted in with reincarnational understanding, is as an upward tree. It's often referred to as a tree of life. You find this often in ancient cultures, what's called the tree of life. And you have simpler forms developing up a tree until they become more and more complex. And that thinking is what we'll trace through tonight. Let me just give you... so I'll put that one back. Yeah. We'll follow that through as we go through tonight. And I'm going to now look at some of the other things in understanding of Hindu thinking. One of the things they believed in was the concept of life from non-life, what we call spontaneous generation, which was accepted for thousands of years, right up till 1869, I think, by Louis Pasteur. It was regarded as being one of the best proofs of evolution, and many of those who, at the time of Charles Darwin, accepted it. Now, they had a more sophisticated understanding of it concerning bacteria, but the more primitive understanding of it was this, that things like mosquitoes, gnats, lice, flies and maggots, other species of this sort, originate from heat, are born of sweat or moisture. This was known in the Egyptian understanding. Aristotle later also took it through into the Western understanding. In other words, that life can come by itself from non-animate to animate, and that is a very important link as we look through. Now, here's some quotations from some of the Hindu writings. This one: they, the plants, have an eternal consciousness. In this terrible cycle of transmigration, that's another word for reincarnation, which moves relentlessly on and on, the levels of existence are said to begin with Brahma, that's the creative principle, remember, and to end with them. Laws of Manu. Another one: whatever creation is born is resolved once more and is moved again by the merits and demerits acquired in that life and enters into another body resulting from its deeds. His habitation always resulting from nascience, desire and acts. He migrates from one body to body, leaving off one another repeatedly, urged on by time, like a person leaving house, one after another, in succession. So you have that reincarnation thing, but you also have an upward push that's going on, driven on by desire. And we'll find this also mentioned in what's called the Padma Purana. It says that there are 20,000 species of non-mobile plants, svara, 900,000 species of aquatic creatures, 900,000 species of amphibians and reptiles, 1 million species of birds, 3 million species of other creatures such as animals, 400 species of anthropoids, that's called vanaras, after which the human species, Manchuria, of 200,000 varieties comes into being, and man then engages in purposeful activity to attain perfection. Now, what they're saying through that is this tree of life coming from a simple form of plants through aquatic creatures, through amphibians and reptiles, through various animals, through to anthropoids, monkeys, through to apes and so forth, through into the human, 200,000 varieties, which is rather a lot, and man engaging in purposeful activity to attain perfection, which is all about the yoga system, which I mentioned just briefly at the end. But also in the Rig Vedas, going back a long time, they also had an understanding, the evolution, when it came to man, you then had the caste system. You had the Sudra, which were the dark-skinned African or Aboriginal human beings. And then there's... this evolution took place through into then the Vaisya, which is a lighter skin, through to the Kshatriya, which is more the warrior caste, lighter skinned again, and finally the Aryans, the white-skinned Brahmin, who were the philosopher kings and the priests, as it were, of Hinduism. Now, interesting enough, when you look, and I'll be dealing with this in a second talk I'll be doing in November, you will see something of that after Charles Darwin was accepted, and through into the 20th century, culminating sadly with the final solution and Hitler's kind of ideas. But you see this whole drive with a supreme Aryan at the top of the evolutionary understanding,